Chapter 12 of The Trevor Case. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. The Trevor Case by Natalie Sumner Lincoln. Chapter 12. Blind Clues. "And what is your opinion, Tillinghast?" asked the secretary. They were sitting alone the next morning in his private office. He had listened attentively to Dick's detailed account of his interview with the Attorney General. "I believe Mr. Trevor's statement," he answered, looking squarely at Secretary Bowers. "And so do I," heartily agreed the other. "Trevor had to buy Madame de Berrios's silence. If the scandal had gotten out, it would have meant social ostracism, not only for the guilty woman, but for Beatrice Trevor and her father as well. It is another case of the innocent suffering with the guilty. Now, Tillinghast, do you know any facts about Mr. Gordon's connection with this affair which have not been made public?" Seeing Dick's hesitancy, he added, "Murders are usually outside my province, I know, but this one touches the President closely. First one of his aides is suspected, then his Attorney General is dragged into the affair. If innocent, they must be cleared as quickly as possible. Come, sir, I must have an answer." "You are right, Mr. Secretary," replied Dick. "I only hesitated fearing I might get Gordon into further trouble." Then, in a few words, he repeated what General Long had told him. "Whew!" whistled the secretary. "That certainly complicates matters. Do you think Trevor knew of Gordon's former infatuation for his wife?" "Indeed, sir, I was afraid to speak of Gordon," confessed Dick. "I didn't know what effect it might have. Mr. Trevor looked so desperately ill and worn." The secretary nodded comprehendingly. "I am going to send for him to lunch with me today, to tell him that he must on no account resign just now, and I will try to find out how much he does know of Mrs. Trevor's old love affair." He paused a moment, then resumed. "There are two things which I think have a bearing on this case." "What are they, Mr. Secretary?" asked Dick eagerly. "First, find out who removed the Attorney General's memorandum book. Secondly, while everyone has tried to prove who entered the Trevor house, no one has sought to find out when a certain member of the household left there." "Whom do you mean?" "Why, what time did the private secretary leave the house, and where did he spend the evening?" "By Jove, I never thought of him." "Look up those two things. I feel sure they will repay you." Then, as Dick picked up his hat and cane, "Tillinghast, you have acted with great discretion in this affair, and I feel convinced you will carry your investigation to a successful issue. If I can be of service to you at any time, come and see me." Thanking the secretary warmly for his encouraging words, Dick hastened out of the room. At the Star office, he found a note awaiting him from Peggy. She asked him to come and see her that afternoon and report progress. "Report progress," groaned poor Dick. "I'm damned if I can. Your Uncle Dudley's up a tree for sure, Peggy darling, but he'll do some tall climbing before he gives up, you bet." "Say, son, the city editor wants you PDQ," called Dan Connor. "Stop mooning and lump yourself." Taking the hint, Dick fled upstairs to the city room on the double quick. "Morning, Dick," said Colonel Byrd. "Gibson has just sent word that he is sick, so you will have to take his place at the Capitol. Get down there early, as there are some important committee meetings to cover. By the way, any further news about the Trevor murder?" "Not now, sir. There may be some new development shortly, though. Can I get off if I hear of anything turning up in that quarter?" "Sure. Drop everything and run. Get your stuff in as quick as you can." And the busy editor turned back to his desk. The clock was just striking 5:30 when Dick, after an eventful day at the Capitol, reached Mrs. McAllister's hospitable mansion on F Street. The old house with its colonial architecture looked like a relic of antebellum days, for standing as it did well back from the sidewalk, with two fine old elms on either side of the brick wall, it had an individuality of its own. A central hall ran through it, the drawing-room and dining-room being to the left of the front door, while the large library and billiard-room were on the other side. The ceilings were very high, which made the house most comfortable in hot weather. That fact, combined with her beautiful rose garden, induced Mrs. McAllister to stay in the city until July. True to the traditions of old Washington, Mrs. McAllister kept her Fridays at home from November until June. The fashion of having only 4 days in a month did not suit her hospitable mind, and those who put first and third Tuesdays or Wednesdays, as the case might be, on their visiting cards drove her nearly frantic. "I was always a poor mathematician," she informed one of her friends. "I know 2 and 2 make 4, but this dot and carry 1 business is beyond me." Therefore, she usually flung the offending pasteboards into the scrap basket and went serenely on her way, returning calls when it suited her pleasure and convenience. Another innovation to which she seriously objected was having tea served in her drawing-room. 5 o'clock tea at home in the bosom of her family was one thing, but having a small tea-table littered with cups and saucers and plates, stuck in one corner with an unhappy matron presiding over it, was quite a different matter. Therefore, every Friday the dining-room table was regularly set and covered with tempting dishes of all descriptions, and Peggy poured tea at one end, and one of her numerous friends was always asked to take care of the hot chocolate at the other. The callers had thinned out by the time Dick arrived. Only about a dozen people, mostly men, were sitting comfortably around the table. His heart sank when he saw De Morney in close attendance upon Peggy. To his jealous eyes they appeared to be on very confidential terms indeed, which completed his misery. Mrs. McAllister beckoned to him to sit by her, so, casting a lingering glance at Peggy, he obediently carried his cup and saucer to her side of the table. "Any further developments on the Trevor murder, Dick?" Mrs. McAllister asked him after a few minutes' chat about other matters. Her words were overheard by a tall, showily dressed woman sitting across the table from them, and she leaned over and joined in the conversation. "Yes, do tell us, Mr. Tillinghast," she begged, with an ingratiating smile. Matilda Gleason was one of 4 sisters who lived in a handsome palace on Columbia Road. It was rumored to have cost in the neighborhood of $200,000. As to the architecture, the Gleasons said it was early English, but having employed 3 architects before the house was completed, the effect was more or less startling. It had been nicknamed Gilded Misery. Where the Gleasons had come from was a mooted question, but they had taken a good many staid Washingtonians into camp by the splendor of their entertainments. Mrs. McAllister had never called upon them, but in an unwary moment the chairman of the board of lady managers of the Children's Hospital had put Miss Gleason on the same committee with Mrs. McAllister, and the former had seized the opportunity to call that afternoon on the pretext of discussing business pertaining to the hospital. "Why, no news at all," answered Dick cautiously. He knew Miss Gleason's love of scandal, and that the sisters had been nicknamed Envy, Hatred, Malice, and All Uncharitableness by one long-suffering matron who had been their victim on several occasions. "When does the case go to the grand jury, Dick?" called Peggy from her end of the table. "In about 10 days, I think." "I hope Mr. Gordon's sentence will be all that the law allows," said Miss Gleason. It was apparent to everyone where the shoe pinched. All Washington, which in some ways is like an overgrown village, knew of her relentless and unsuccessful pursuit of Gordon during the month that he had been stationed at the White House, and several of the men present, who had suffered from the same cause, smiled to themselves. "It is not at all certain he committed the crime," said Mrs. McAllister freezingly. "He virtually admitted it," retorted Miss Gleason. "We look on a man as innocent until proven guilty, you know, Miss Gleason," answered Dick quietly. "Well, if he isn't guilty, who is?" asked Miss Gleason. "The burglar," promptly chimed in Peggy. "Nonsense, my dear. Why should such a person use a hatpin when he had his revolver? And where would he get such a thing?" For a moment Peggy was at a loss for a reply. She had the same doubt herself, but she was determined not to give it to Miss Gleason. "Horrid old cat!" Count de Morny, all unconsciously, came to her rescue. The other guests were silently listening to the discussion. "I think Madame Trevor have stuck herself with the pin," he volunteered, struggling with the langue terrible, which he had never been able to master. "But yes, monsieur," catching Dick's incredulous stare, "did not the doctor say it was possible for one who was left-handed to strike herself the blow?" "How do you know Mrs. Trevor was left-handed?" demanded Miss Gleason loudly. "I have played the cards with her most often," answered de Morny simply. "But why should Mrs. Trevor commit suicide?" asked Dick unbelievingly. De Morny shrugged his shoulders, and answered his question with another. "Why should Monsieur Gordon kill her?" "That's right," declared Captain McLean of the U.S. Marine Corps. "Why should he? I served 3 years on board the same cruiser with Donald Gordon, and there isn't a more honorable, lovable fellow in the service. It is absolutely unbelievable that he could perpetrate so ghastly a crime." As Dick looked across at Peggy, he caught Count de Smirnoff's eye. The Russian was sitting between his hostess and Miss Gleason. For the first time he joined in the conversation. "Your theory is weak, Henri," he said mildly. "Why should a young and beautiful woman, who enjoys health, wealth, and a happy home, kill herself?" "You never can tell about the ladies," retorted de Morny obstinately. "They are, what you say, a law unto themselves, and easily wrought over and deviled up. They make trifles into mountains." "Granting that Mrs. Trevor might have had a motive for suicide," said Dick, smiling at the excited Frenchman, "it was utterly impossible for a dead woman to lock herself in the safe." "Could she not have killed herself in the safe after shutting the door?" inquired de Smirnoff. Dick shook his head. "Possibly you do not recollect that witnesses testified at the inquest that her left arm was pressed tightly against the door jamb, supporting her weight." "She might have fallen forward into that position." "I hardly think it likely. Mr. Clark, who was the first inmate of the household to find Mrs. Trevor, testified that her body was literally wedged into the safe." "You have but his word for it." A peculiar tone in the speaker's voice caused Dick to glance sharply at him, but he learned nothing from the Russian's face. It was expressionless. Before Dick could pursue his questions, Miss Gleason threw herself into the conversation. "How is that dear Mr. Clark bearing up under this terrible tragedy?" she asked, addressing Peggy directly. "He looked very well the last time I saw him," said the latter, a twinkle of mischief in her deep blue eyes. "I am so glad to hear it. You know, dear Mrs. McAllister, he is such a delightful man to have around. He always looks after one so attentively. I never want for anything when he is in the room. And then he is so handsome, so cultivated." It is a dreadful blow having him in mourning." "I wasn't aware he is in mourning," said Peggy, surprised. "Has he lost a relative?" "Oh, no. But of course he will accept no invitations now, on account of his engagement to Beatrice Trevor." "What?" Peggy nearly overturned the urn in her excitement. "Miss Gleason, you are entirely mistaken. Beatrice never was engaged to Mr. Clark." "Indeed? Mrs. Trevor led me to suppose otherwise. From what she said, I gathered the engagement was to be announced shortly. It is not surprising I thought it a love match," she continued, catching a glimpse of Peggy's indignant expression. "He is desperately attentive to her, and I see them together all the time." "Speaking of seeing people," broke in Captain McLean, "have you seen Bertie Lee since he and his wife returned from their honeymoon? He came into the club the other night looking absolutely woebegone." "He did indeed," laughed Dick. "I couldn't help thinking of the lines, 'When I think on what I are and what I uster was, I feel I threw myself away without sufficient cause.'" "They suit him to a T," agreed McLean, helping himself to a glass of cherry bounce. "You know the Cortlandt Browns, do you not, Mrs. McAllister?" asked Miss Gleason, pulling on her gloves preparatory to departing. "I hear they are going to air their marital troubles in court, but it's a long story, and I must go. Good-bye, dear Mrs. McAllister, such a delightful afternoon. Good-bye, everybody. Don't get up." She waved her hand to them all and tripped out of the room. "The wicked flee when no man pursueth," quoted Mrs. McAllister, a naughty twinkle in her eye. "Have you heard of the dinner the Gleasons gave at which they separated the goats from the sheep?" asked Captain McLean. "They served Veuve Clicquot at one table and American champagne at the other." "Oh, why do we put up with such ill-bred behavior?" cried Peggy impulsively. "My dear, you are wrong," said Mrs. McAllister. "The Gleasons belong to a large class who show 'the unconscious insolence of conscious wealth,' as one of our statesmen aptly puts it." "Miss Gleason is very highly colored for a woman of her years," said de Smirnoff gravely. "Highly colored!" exclaimed Mrs. McAllister. "It's a wonder she doesn't die of painter's colic. Must you go?" as her guests rose from the table, and she walked with them into the drawing-room. It was some few minutes before the other callers started on their way, and Dick listened with what patience he could muster to their interminable good-byes. But Peggy soon joined him in the drawing-room. "Now, sir, give an account of yourself," she said with mock severity. "You haven't been near me since the ball." A sudden recollection caused her to blush hotly, and Dick thought what a lovely, dainty bit of femininity she was. Her shimmering crêpe de chine princess dress of sapphire blue showed up her blonde beauty in a way to tantalize any man, let alone poor Dick, who was already hopelessly in the toils. Dick promptly lost his head. "Peggy," he stammered, "dearest, be—" "What are you two talking about?" asked Mrs. McAllister, coming suddenly back into the room. Nothing," gasped Dick, who had a wholesome dread of incurring her displeasure. Having a very modest opinion of himself, he feared she would bitterly oppose his suit. "I was just going to ask Peggy about Alfred Clark and Beatrice Trevor. Was there ever anything between them, Peggy?" "Well, really, Dick—" "I know, Peggy. I know you won't break a confidence, but indeed it is important that I know." Peggy debated for a moment while Mrs. McAllister looked thoughtfully at them. What were those two young people up to? It behooved her to find out. "Then I think I'd better tell you, Dick, particularly as I'm not breaking any confidence. Alfred Clark is devoted to Beatrice, and I overheard him making desperate love to her at their house on Tuesday night, or rather Wednesday morning. I was searching for Beatrice to say good-bye, and walked in upon them in the private office. You know it was a very large party, and the entire first floor was thrown open to accommodate the guests. Beatrice seemed glad of the interruption, but Mr. Clark looked as black as a thundercloud. I rather enjoyed his discomfiture." And Peggy laughed at the recollection. "One gets so tired of his perpetual smile." "Do you think Miss Trevor returns his affection?" Peggy looked troubled. "Beatrice is very reserved," she said. "She seldom speaks of men's attentions to her, even to me, her best friend. If you had asked me that question a month ago, I would have said positively no. But lately, Beatrice, without actually encouraging Mr. Clark, has allowed him to be with her more than formally." "Then you think—" "I don't know what I think," pettishly. "Was this supper given the night before the murder?" "Yes. Madame Bernhardt was the guest of honor." "Was Gordon there by chance?" "Oh, yes. He took me out to supper, and was just as jolly and nice as he could be." "I am sorry to interrupt you young people," called Mrs. McAllister from the doorway. She had strolled out into the hall to speak to her maid. "But I must remind Peggy that she has to dress for a dinner at the Pattersons." "Gracious!" exclaimed Dick in dismay, glancing at his watch. "I had no idea it was so late. Do forgive me, Mrs. McAllister, for staying so long." "I will, provided you promise to come and dine with us on Wednesday next, at 8 o'clock." Peggy's eyes seconded the invitation, and Dick accepted so joyfully that Mrs. McAllister's eyes danced wickedly. "Count de Smirnoff is very agreeable," she said, as Peggy left the room, "and I am indebted to Count de Morny for bringing him to see me. They had been to the drill at Fort Myer, and the Russian gave a most entertaining account of it. It is a relief to talk to him after struggling with Count de Morny's broken English." "It is, indeed," agreed Dick heartily. "Poor de Morny certainly murders the King's English." "I asked Count de Smirnoff to call again," pursued Mrs. McAllister. "I like him, and we have many mutual friends." "How long is he going to be here?" "Until the Grand Duke returns to New York. Good night, Dick. Come and see us soon again." Chapter 12